everyone, why don't we dive in, because I think we've achieved the impossible and started right on time for the last panel of the day, which I think is the unicorn of Zoom webinars. So we've achieved that. So we are at our final panel of the day after having panels through over the last 3 hours on the Chinese bond market, macro opportunities, Hong Kong in regards to Chinese capital formation. And frankly, the one for me, which is the most interesting one, is Chinese listings here in the United States. And before I pass it over to our moderator, Alison Schomburg from the US-China Business Council, just one housekeeping item. Everyone you'll be on a participation, will be on listen-only mode. But if you have a question for Alison, just pop it in the Q&A function down the bottom of the screen, and she will do her level best to get to that over the course of the next 55 minutes. So Alison, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks, Paul. So as Paul just mentioned, I'm Alison Schomburg. I'm a business advisory services manager at the US-China Business Council, and I've been really looking forward to our event today on Chinese corporate listings in the United States. The financial services space has generally been seen as a pretty safe, relatively unscathed space in US-China relations that's actually seen several positive developments over the past year. More licenses for wholly foreign-owned or majority foreign-owned financial services companies in China, greater financial opening in China, deeper integration of China into global financial markets, and a continued high number of IPOs from Chinese companies that want to list in the United States. But recent developments have led to some cause for concern. Congress's Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act and a report from the President's Working Group on Financial Markets highlight risks that Chinese companies pose to US investors and could lead to the delisting of Chinese companies on US exchanges as early as 2022. We've invited two speakers to shed more light on this and implications for US companies, Claudius Modesti and Liza Mark. Claudius is a partner at Akin Gump and was formerly a Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement attorney, federal prosecutor, and first director of the Division of Enforcement for the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Liza Mark is the administrative partner of the Shanghai office of Haynes and Boone and practiced both in the US and in Hong Kong as a capital markets attorney. As Paul mentioned, if you have any questions during or after the presentation, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom and submit your question publicly. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to them for their presentation.
Thank you, Alison. Give me a minute so I can share the screen on the presentation. Okay, so today we're going to take a spin through a bit of history to give you guys all context on what had happened before regarding Chinese companies that came to the US for listing, and a bit of history on the trials and tribulations on the regulatory side as to what has passed, shall we say, on these Chinese companies meeting the listing requirements in the US. And then after that, we'll talk about essentially the current legislation that's on the books or being developed, and then take a look through for what we expect to happen in the future. So as of June 2020, there are 202 Chinese companies listed on US major stock exchanges, representing about $1.8 trillion in market cap. Chinese companies have traditionally in the last 10, 15 years been looking at the US market as the gold standard, right? Anyone that is the CEO or officer of a Chinese company that achieved a US listing on NASDAQ or NYSE would be fettered in their community. Of course, the US market has a great deal of prestige, is a very deep trading market, and until about 5 years ago, really, there is no other market very much like it where you could continuously tap for capital. So the US market to Chinese companies is sort of very much, okay, you've graduated to the big leagues. So you're seeing ebbs and flows in the last 10 years as to how Chinese companies have come to the US market. In 2010 and before 2010, there was a build-up slowly of Chinese companies looking to the U.S. market, making all the compliance requirements, corporate governance, so on and so forth, which culminated in 2010 in a record high of 43 Chinese companies having IPOs in the U.S. But then after that, in the period of 2011 to 2012, there was a bunch of scandals, a deluge of delistings or trading suspensions, and so on and so forth, around 40 of those companies. And then 2014 saw Alibaba list very successfully in the US, which then allowed kind of other Chinese companies to be perceived fairly well. And again, in 2017 to 19, there is a major flurry of successful Chinese companies that came and listed in the US and didn't really have a lot of scandals like iQIYI, Pinduoduo, and Tencent, or Tencent Music. So this is a graphical representation of how the IPO trend kind of happened. 2010, a major banner year. There were scandals, difficulties, so on and so forth. And then 17 to 19, it was just going up. And then, of course, COVID hit, and 2020 was a slightly slow year for the first part of it. But you are literally seeing a great deal of flow still coming from Chinese companies looking to list in the U.S. Now, that's the listing in U.S. The flip side of the data is very much about kind of short selling and Chinese companies getting into trouble. Since 2010, there were short sellers that were targeting particularly Chinese companies because of their difference in reporting, a lot of their kind of accounting practices and non-disclosure and so on and so forth. And it breaks out into two different periods where between 2010 and 2013, a incomplete survey of the highly well-known short sellers like Muddy Waters and so on had targeted 16 Chinese companies that were listed in the U.S. And between 2017 until now, they targeted 14 companies. The reaction of companies that were targeted by short sellers that generally kind of issue short and then issue a report saying, here's why we think this company is very problematic. The results of those targets, we have noticed, have significantly shifted. So for the 16 companies targeted in the earlier period, the impact is quite severe. There were a significant portion that eventually delisted from the U.S. market. Whereas for the 14 companies that were targeted in the later period, none of them had eventually delisted. And they were successful in sort of explaining themselves and getting back into the good graces. So you are seeing, on one hand, that they are slowly getting better at complying with all of the reporting requirements in the U.S. market. And then, of course, potentially they're also getting better at playing this game. However, 2019 and 2020 brought one major scandal that focused the market and also focused the legislation. And that would be the story of Luckin Coffee. Now, Luckin Coffee is China's answer to Starbucks. Starbucks, of course, is a very, very successful company in the U.S. and around the world. And China had an imitation. And they were also very successful in China, at least on its face, grew extremely rapidly, and came to the U.S. And did an IPO in May of 2019 on NASDAQ. Their advisors were the creme de la creme, all right? But the bankers, the lawyers, everybody was top of the line. And usually these types of IPO deals, when they have very credible advisors, are not expected to run into trouble, at least not expected to run into trouble very quickly. The scandal came when Muddy Waters in January of this year issued a short seller report and challenged a lot of the revenue that was booked for Luckin Coffee during their reporting period for their IPO prospectus. And the funny part was Luckin did an internal investigation and admitted to fault, which created this, right? You're looking at the price chart of Luckin Coffee, and essentially their price market value dropped by 94% before they were delisted. They received delisting notice in May. They were investigated by China's State Administration for Market Regulation starting April. Just 2 days ago, SIMRA had fined Luckin and some of the related companies, 43 of them, a total of about $9 million US. And the $9 million as a fine is probably not that big a deal. The fact that SIMRA has you on its gun sights, that's a very big deal in China. So this scandal, especially given how high profile it was when it came out to market, and how much sort of vetting was supposedly had happened and how quickly it broke down, I think rang a warning bell for a lot of the regulators that were looking at the U.S. market, and certainly played into a lot of the fears of, hey, are a lot of these Chinese companies cooking their books? So let me hand it off to Claudius to give a little bit of background as to the longstanding regulatory concerns for Chinese companies. Claudius?
With everything on my screen, I couldn't find the button. Thank you. Thank you to Paul. Thank you to Allison. Thank you to Liza for having me on this panel. Appreciate the opportunity. So let's go back to maybe what we can consider the root of this regulatory tension that we're talking about regarding Chinese companies listed on US markets. For many of our listeners, some of this may be very obscure because while many of you know the Securities and Exchange Commission, many of you may not have heard about the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board until some of these recent events. And we really have to go back to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to put these, this tension into proper context. And what the Sarbanes-Oxley Act did, among many other things, was it created the PCAOB, and it required that the PCAOB inspect all of the largest audit firms who produce more than 100 audit reports a year, every year, and every other audit firm that issues an audit report every 3 years. So encompassed in that were both domestic public companies listed in the United States as well as foreign-based public companies. And obviously here that included China-based companies listed in the United States. I think at the time, the focus for the Sarbanes-Oxley Act were the spectacular domestic frauds, WorldCom, Enron, Adelphia. But the Congress decided to expand the jurisdiction of the US regulatory regime to include not only the audits of these foreign-based companies listed here, but more importantly, which is the jurisdiction of the PCAOB, the audits themselves. And as the PCAOB started to march forward and decide how it was going to exercise its jurisdiction, it ran into some headwinds about how it was going to actually look at these foreign-based audit firms who were auditing companies around the globe, not just in China. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those headwinds and where that all developed. But as Liza pointed out, the sort of low boil issue that emerged with Chinese-based companies on our exchanges really had to do with these entities who came into the US regulatory markets, publicly traded markets, through reverse mergers. So they came in through these public shells where they merged the Chinese company into the shell, and they were able then to obtain their listing through that shell. And so some of the frauds that emerged in that time period around 08, 09, and 2010 that related to these Chinese companies were mostly no-name companies. Sure, the frauds that were reported were significant, but these were not household names in terms of Chinese companies. And once that spate of companies were either delisted or went dark, so to speak, things in that respect quieted down. So what did the PCAOB do in reaction to those events? Well, the PCAOB had been negotiating with the Chinese government over access to China-based audit firms, but the PCAOB started to react with very specific regulatory actions. And one thing they did was they told firms that wanted to register with the PCAOB, which would allow them to do these audits, that they should only be expected to be registered if the PCAOB would have access to the firm for inspection. And then at the same time, the PCAOB started to publish lists of publicly traded companies. And this is now in the 2009 and the 2010 timeframe, public companies whose auditors the PCAOB did not have access to. And so you start to see that low boil occur in this context. At the same time this is going on, or very soon thereafter, the SEC brings enforcement proceedings against the Chinese affiliates of the Big Four audit firms for not producing documents in connection with SEC investigations. And that proceeding goes on for quite a while. Eventually, it results in a settlement where the Chinese Securities Regulatory Commission, the SEC counterpart, agreed to provide assistance to the SEC, and that matter was settled. And so things since that 2015 time period until very recently was very much under the radar in terms of the focus on Chinese companies. So where are we in terms of some of these regulatory concerns? Well, going back to 2013, the PCAOB negotiated a memorandum of understanding with their Chinese counterparts to allow the PCAOB access to audit work papers and other relevant information in connection with PCAOB enforcement matters. That's something that I directly worked on and that I was a part of in terms of the negotiations and implementation. And again, we have this relative quiet period. We're not seeing any enforcement cases come out. We're not seeing a lot of public pronouncements about the possible tensions between the US regulatory regime and the Chinese position on why they don't want certain information produced to US regulators until about December of 2018, where Chairman Clayton of the SEC and Chairman Duncan of the PCAOB issued this joint statement talking fairly bluntly about the access challenges they had with respect to access to information about Chinese companies and Chinese auditors. The statement doesn't really offer a roadmap for how the regulators are going to respond. The sense is that there are negotiations going on, that this is an opportunity to remind people about these access issues, but we don't really hear much again until November of 2019, where again, the two same chairmen issue a statement about discussions they're having with the global audit firms about how they're addressing audit quality. Our audience should understand that the largest audit firms are distinct legal entities. So the Chinese affiliates are their own legal entities. The US firm is a member of network, it's its own legal entity, but the SEC and the PCAOB are engaged on audit quality considerations with the largest firms. And then in more recent past, we have in April 2020, the SEC and the PCAOB issuing much more of a warning to investors about emerging market companies, their risks, some of the disclosure issues, the limited access to information on China. And again, there's not a clear roadmap about what the SEC and PCAOB is going to do, but we then have the legislation kick in that we're going to talk about a little later on. And after that legislation is introduced and passed in the Senate on Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act legislation, you then have the SEC hosting a roundtable, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this conversation. But just to go back for a moment quickly on the Chinese PCAOB negotiations, the PCAOB encountered headwinds when it tried to gain access to European countries, audit firms, and other audit firms in other jurisdictions. Eventually, they worked out bilateral agreements and were able to gain access under what the PCAOB calls a joint inspection model, where the PCAOB and their foreign counterpart work cooperatively in conducting these inspections. Excuse me for a moment. While all this is going on, the Chinese are expressing their preference that the PCAOB recognize their Chinese counterparts as the regulatory equivalent of the US regulators. PCAOB is resisting that for a lot of reasons, but that is at least the Chinese position in terms of how it's viewing this from a macro point of view. There then is some collaboration between the PCAOB and the Chinese regulators, where the PCAOB has a chance to look at how the Chinese regulators are reviewing some of the Chinese affiliates' quality control systems. I talked about the MOU that the Chinese regulators and the PCAOB signed in 2013. And then we have this relative quiet period, and you now have this question of where are the discussions, negotiations, what's the status of the PCAOB and Chinese discussions around access. I think what we know from public pronouncements and from putting together the tea leaves is there's probably some discussions going on, but the same lines that have been drawn in the past, I think, are still lines in the sand. The PCAOB, on the one hand, given the requirements of Sarbanes-Oxley, needs sufficient access to work papers and other information for these Chinese affiliate audit firms. The Chinese have their own significant concerns about whether information turned over to US regulators would produce or would reveal state secrets and other sensitive information. And from what we're gathering from some of the give and take that was published recently between the PCAOB and the Chinese authorities, those issues are not resolved. And I'm expecting that while negotiations may continue, given how these issues now have surfaced in the larger context of tensions between the United States and China, it's going to be very challenging for one side or the other to come up with a compromise position so that access could be resolved. So, Liza, I think that's my quick history of the regulatory tension and where we are today, particularly on the issue of PCAOB access.
Sure. So just very quickly, Claudius gave you the list of, hey, Sarbanes-Oxley generated the PCAOB. PCAOB then had the duty and obligation to inspect kind of the audit firms that then audit the companies that list in the US, or at least their financial statements. Just so the audience understands, I will very quickly spin through what are the legal basis under Chinese law that causes all these audit firms to have massive heartburns when they are then supposedly obligated to allow PCAOB to come in and inspect them. There are actually 3 sets of laws, and very murky laws, if I do say so myself, as to why the audit firms are very tense and wanting to get permission from the Chinese government. The first set of law is, of course, the Chinese Securities Law, where they very specifically say that all financial records of security firms and security service institutions are required to be stored within the territory of China. And nobody can provide documents or materials related to securities business activities overseas. The second set of issues is most of the Chinese companies that listed in the US in the early stages, right? So the early stage where US companies or Chinese companies went and listed in the US, they were mostly state-owned enterprises, very, very large, very well-established companies in the energy, transportation, communication, and pharmaceutical space. And these companies would have legitimate concern that some of their work papers have state secrets contained in them. Because, again, unlike the US model, the Chinese corporate model is very much sort of dual ownership, at least for the state-owned enterprises, dual ownership by the government and also by kind of private enterprises. So under those circumstances, you have state secret law considerations, and like every other country, what is deemed a state secret is generally fairly broadly defined, right? And so it is, again, very specifically stated that if you trip any material that is state secret, then no carrier can allow you to take the state secret abroad by whatever means necessary, right? The third set of legal background, shall we say, that prohibits this ability to allow PCAOB to come in and inspect is something that I don't think most Western countries have. It's the archival law of China, where a lot of records are by edict under Chinese law required to be kept. And these records are, again, required to be kept within China and cannot be carried or transported out of the country without authorization, and certainly could not be shown to a foreign governing body because that would then be considered carrying it out of the country. So it is not baseless that the audit firms based in China or in Hong Kong that are trying to audit and serve the companies that look to listing in the U.S., that they're just doing this for spite or for any other reason. They do have legal considerations that they have to work through. Now, I think most of the audit firms, and quite frankly, most of the companies that come and list in the U.S. would love it if the Chinese government and the U.S. government sort of work out a system where they could do what they're supposed to. And this is beyond the scope of this discussion, but there were sort of one of the big four that got into serious trouble because they audited a company that listed in Hong Kong, and eventually what they did was, I have all the records, please tell me what to do with them, right? So this is very much, there's two sets of regulatory burdens that are not really jiving and matching very well. And so under those circumstances, the companies and the audit firms are trapped in the middle. So let's quickly look at what the regulatory situation is in the U.S. As alluded to by Claudius just now, there is this regulation or a piece of legislation that had come out in early this year, in part in response to the FCC and PCAOB positions and pronouncements, and in part because of the scandal of Luckin Coffee, and everybody's focus is suddenly saying, hey, right, are we allowing Chinese companies that haven't cooked their books onto our market, or is there a significant danger here? And the piece of legislation was first called Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, was first adopted by the Senate. It had bipartisan support going through the Senate. It was adopted in May. And the House had a very similar piece that was kind of put into a very large bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is considered a must-pass bill. And if this bill is enacted, it will amend the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to impose requirements on the companies that are listed on their audit and the PCAOB inspection obligations for those audits. So basically, you can understand it to mean that if a company is listed on the U.S. exchanges and for 3 consecutive years, that issuer is audited by a firm that cannot be inspected by PCAOB, then the consequences are you get kicked off, right? You get delisted because you could no longer fulfill the listing requirements. There are remedial ways of saying, yes, I will go and get a compliant auditor, and then you get to be able to list again. But if you fail, then it's an automatic mandatory 5-year prohibition. On top of that, the Act itself says or requires or mandates that for any non-inspection year, i.e. any year by which you did not get a PCAOB inspected accounting firm to give you an audit opinion, you are subject to heightened disclosure obligations. And these heightened disclosure obligations are extremely sensitive. So you're supposed to disclose your share of ownership by governmental agencies. You are supposed to disclose whether any governmental entities have controlling financial interests in this company. And very specifically, you're supposed to disclose whether any board members are officials of the Chinese Communist Party, and you are supposed to name the Chinese Communist Party members on your board. And of course, disclose whether your articles of incorporation have any charters of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, these would be highly, highly sensitive if it comes to that, right? None of your board members would want to ever publicly proclaim whether they're a Chinese Communist Party or not, because that is generally considered sensitive information. So they are certainly making it difficult for Chinese companies and to list in the U.S. and applying more pressure just so that we can kind of sort out the PCA situation, audit situation or inspection situation. But I think most of the business community thinks that this is to be worked out between the two regulators, and they can't really do anything about it. But Claudius, why don't you take us through the sort of legislative history and where you think this is going, and the roundtable report that came out that is sort of like parallel to this?
So maybe we should just go back for a moment. You know, why has all of the controversy focused on this very narrow Sarbanes-Oxley requirement? And I just want the audience to appreciate, I think what happened on the US side was they had a very neat and clean requirement, which seemed fairly innocuous and which the rest of the world has embraced, which is the PCAOB can go and look at the audits of any listed company, regardless where they're located around the world. And it's not an enforcement issue. It's not a more judgmental area. We just want to come look at your work papers. So I think the US side picked something that they thought was going to be uncontroversial as a way to show domestically, but even globally, that these Chinese companies and indirectly the Chinese government are not willing to play ball in that respect. So that's why we're looking at this in the context of this legislation, because that's what the legislation could easily key off of without having to go through a lot of rigmarole. We now have versions of the bill that have to be passed by both the House and the Senate. There are some differences. The House version has a different concept for which companies would delist based on whether the non-compliant auditor is performing a certain amount of work. In this case, if it's less than 1/3 of the work, then they would not be subject to delisting. Liza talked about how the House version has been made part of the NDAA, which again gives it a much greater chance of passing. So we're left with what I consider the first sort of the first shot across the bow on the U.S. side, which is the passing of this legislation. So while this is going on, and let me just go back for a moment to the NDAA, because that probably will be the vehicle, or is a good chance will be the vehicle for this bill to make its way to the president's desk. The House and the Senate will have to put their conference committee together. They've started negotiations and discussions. They need to mention and name the members of the conference committee. We're not expecting that committee to come together before the election. So it's more likely going to occur after the election, sometime in December. But this is a piece of legislation that, as Liza said, is must pass. And given that the House version is already in there, there's a much better chance of this moving forward. So while this is going on, we had the SEC Virtual Roundtable, which was the SEC's initial response to the risks of these emerging market companies. It covered broader issues than this question of PCAOB access to these China company audit firms. It talked more broadly about how fiduciaries are handling their responsibilities to educate their clients and their customers about the risks in emerging markets, talked about whether the SEC should require additional disclosures. As many of you know from reading the SEC filings, the 20F filings of China-based companies, There's already disclosure about the PCAOB's lack of access to the auditor for these companies and things along those lines. But there was discussion about a broader set of disclosures. As you would expect, most of the participants in the roundtable thought that the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act was the wrong tool and the wrong solution. And they thought that there was probably going to be some negative unintended consequences. And we'll talk a little bit later about what's happening in the China-based markets in reaction to some of these movements on the US regulatory side. But the question being, if these companies were to leave US exchanges and move to China, how would US investors in these companies be harmed and hurt because of how their holdings would be devalued, and they would not necessarily see a realization of the value of those holdings based on some of these transitions. So at the same time, there's the question about how the Chinese are reacting to the overtures to try to gain access. So as the SEC is having the roundtable, the president announces this presidential working group. And to me, at least, this is the administration's effort to sort of take this question, this issue about Chinese company access to US markets, sort of take it out of the legislative process and gain a little more control over where this is going to go. The legislation did not impose an immediate deadline for when this would have to occur. It gave a pretty long ramp, plus 3 years for when these requirements would have to be met. And the president's approach with the working group was to come up with some proposals, and they ended up coming up with 5 recommendations to try to address this issue of Chinese access. And most people have focused on this question and this proposed solution of what we've called this co-audit model. Some people are perplexed by this, and there's a reason they're perplexed. This is new. This is different. It was intended to be new and different as a proposal. There really is there's no model for this or cookie cutter approach to this in other jurisdictions, certainly not in the US jurisdiction. And so it's going to require rulemaking by the SEC. The point raised by the report was that there'd have to probably be changes to the listing standards. But again, the suggestion is the SEC would have to commence that rulemaking and sort of be the initiator on all this. And this co-audit model, as far as we can tell, and the details would have to be flushed out by both the SEC and the PCAOB in terms of rulemaking and standards, is having a US firm, a US-based audit firm, lead the audit, be the principal auditor, so to speak, use as needed staff of the Chinese firm and leverage that for local knowledge, local skills, but for the US audit firm to take responsibility, use their skills, use their knowledge of accounting and auditing to do the audit. And then here comes the trick. They have to be able to bring their work papers from this audit to the United States or make them accessible to US regulators. And so where people are scratching their heads is how is this a game changer? And how is this a realistic path to a solution for this tension between the US and Chinese requirements imposed on these audit firms and their clients? And there's really no good answer to that. So as this is going on and as we're awaiting the SEC reaction, and by the way, I should add, I learned that Bill Hinman, who's the director of the Division of Corporation Finance, spoke at the business law section of the ABA the other day, and this issue came up about the co-audit model and proposals on listing standards, and he mentioned to the group that the SEC was reaching out to the industry on what they're going to do. We don't know what that means. We don't know if that means they're going to go to investment advisors and other regulated SEC entities. Are they going to go to the accounting firms that are implicated by this? Are they going to reach out to people that represent the issuers from China that are involved? It's hard to tell. But we are expecting something to happen. There's something to happen in terms of between now and the end of the year. There very well might be a proposal on this, rulemaking by the SEC under the president's recommendations. Whether that timeline changes based on what happens in the election. I'm expecting there still will be some proposal regardless of the outcome of the election, because I think there'll be a lot of pressure to keep things moving forward. But what else, let's just go for a moment, what else is the administration doing in terms of trying to put pressure on these Chinese listed companies? There was the letters sent to the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, known as the board that oversees the Thrift Savings Plan. They were going to move to an index that was going to be more representative of Chinese companies and more weighted in favor of Chinese companies. And after a series of letters from the administration, that board backed down and decided not to go forward with that implementation. There's the U.S. Railroad Retirement Board. I didn't really focus on them before this controversy came up. They have a related trust. They were asked if they're invested in Chinese companies, and they confirmed that they are not. They would consider the risks involved that the administration raised with them as well. And then most recently, you've had Undersecretary Keith Krach of the State Department advise the boards of U.S. university endowments that they should consider divesting in these Chinese companies because they're likely to be delisted. And so you have this almost self-fulfilled prophecy approach that's going on, where the administration is certainly using the levers it can through its the power it has over political appointments and through regulation through the SEC, but also using the bully pulpit to try to maintain the narrative that these Chinese companies are not only risky, but you'd be supporting the Chinese government and the Chinese military by investing in these companies. And that's the narrative Liza referred to that the legislation is trying to promote as well. The other question that's come up, which people have been focused on and concerned about, is will the rulemaking, will the legislation that's being proposed, will it unnecessarily pull in the multinationals, which are not these Chinese-based companies, but are either U.S. multinationals with Chinese operations or non-China-based multinationals who are listed on our exchanges. Again, if the outcome here is, and the solution excessively ropes in some of these multinationals, it'll make our exchanges and markets less desirable, and it'll create significant tensions with some of our allies. And so I think whatever is going to be proposed, particularly on the SEC side, I think we'll very carefully and surgically think about articulating how the focus is on emerging market auditors that we do not have access to on the regulatory side. And so the expectation is that if the multinational has a auditor who's issuing the audit report that's accessible to the PCAOB, that's not going to be a problem. And if they have a firm that's participating in the audit that's not accessible to the PCAOB, that's not going to be a problem either. And that was the concern, is that with significant Chinese operations for some of these multinationals, would they get pulled into this? And I think everyone's expecting that any SEC rulemaking will make that clear that that's not the intention.
Looking at the crystal ball a little bit, obviously we've walked you through kind of 10 years of history as to what exactly is going on for Chinese companies that are listing in the U.S. and the problems that they have encountered or generated, and the current sort of legislative position in the context of the current sort of U.S.-China tensions. Of course, the question is, well, is China going to retaliate? And I don't think that's likely, because as Claudius says, these rules have been on the books since Sarbanes-Oxley, more than 10 years. So under those circumstances, really there's no moral right where you could say, look, you're accessing the U.S. capital markets, but you don't, because you're a Chinese company, don't have to, in fact, comply by the rules. However, the fact that the Chinese government doesn't retaliate doesn't mean that money doesn't flow somewhere else, right? A lot of companies, particularly high growth technology Chinese companies, are already hedging their bets and are looking to raise capital somewhere else, like Hong Kong, where they could get a similar solution to their business needs of capital raise and very deep market and international money. And so the anticipation is if the U.S. market is no longer as attractive to Chinese companies, a lot of them would consider alternatives. Hong Kong, of course, is trying its damnedest to capture that flow. The Chinese market, of course, is also, the Chinese regulator is doing everything they can to, in fact, increase the attractiveness of the Shanghai A and the Shenzhen CNET board by opening a star board in Shanghai and allowing the CNET in Shenzhen to go to a registration system rather than an approval system. And so we're slightly out of time, but let's go through it very, very quickly. For Hong Kong, they have significantly amended their listing standards in 2018 to provide for 3 major changes. And there are 2 that affect what we're looking at and the flows we're looking at right now. The first is they are allowing weighted voting rights structures, where in the past it was 1 share, 1 vote, absolutely no way. And then, of course, Hong Kong lost Alibaba's listing, and that created a massive backlash. And they sat down and said, well, maybe for these very, very high-flying, high-profile, very profitable companies, we should consider allowing them to have weighted voting rights, where the founders would then maintain control on the company side while sharing the economic benefits of it. The second is, the second major change is where they accept companies with business focus in Greater China for secondary listing. Now, these are not for the small to medium-sized mom and pops, okay? These are seriously for very high-profile companies. So, for example, for the weighted voting rights structure, the listing requirements are sort of upped to where the minimum market capitalization requirement is 40 billion Hong Kong dollars. Whereas for the secondary listing route, you have to have a minimum market capitalization of 10 billion before you can access that route. So Hong Kong is sort of, because there's a tension between China and US, they are in the enviable position of being able to cherry pick the best companies and saying, hey, you know, you can come back and list on our situation as long as you are the companies that we want. So for Chinese companies looking at the situation, they could delist completely from the US and do a full-blown IPO in Hong Kong, or apply for dual primary listing in Hong Kong, which means you have to comply with the rules in Hong Kong and also in the US as if you were listed in both places. And that's generally less attractive because the regulatory burden is quite high. And then the third one since 2018 was to be mainly listed in the US, but also maintain a hedge where you're secondary listed in Hong Kong. So should anything happen to your US listing, you have an active trading market in Hong Kong. Just to show you how the flows work, in November of 2019, Alibaba had raised $11 billion in its secondary offering in Hong Kong. NetEase and JD.com raised in June $2.7 billion, $3.88 billion respectively. Baidu is looking at a secondary offering. We're talking about major amounts of money. And so 10 years ago, Hong Kong might not have that depth, but it's proven very, very true today that international money is flowing through Hong Kong, and it has the depth to take these types of companies. Another factoid is for the first 8 months of 2020, there were 91 IPOs that happened in Hong Kong, and their total funds raised increased by 74.7%. That's a huge bump. And you're now looking at Ant Financial, which is expecting to have a $30 billion money raise in both Shanghai and Hong Kong, and that's going to happen kind of very quickly. Going to the China market, where the Chinese side is also trying to make their onshore markets more attractive. The Shanghai STAR market had 49 listings, raising kind of 52.3 billion renminbi in the first half of 2020. And the Shenzhen Xinet went into a registration-based initial public offering system, whereby you don't price discovery, and the timing of you going out to the market is very much controlled by the company rather than by the regulator. So under those circumstances, you are seeing a great deal of, shall we say, evolution and development in the China and kind of Hong Kong markets, whereby they are potentially getting to the point where they could support their own funding requirements for Chinese companies. And you are at the same time seeing the US markets becoming more difficult to access. And so certainly we are expecting that a lot of fundraising would be migrating more towards the Asian markets. And with that, I think we ran you through a lot of data and a lot of materials in a very short period of time. And I'll hand it back to Allison for any questions.
Thank you both for that incredibly thorough presentation on U.S. government efforts to potentially delist U.S.-listed Chinese companies. That the historical context in particular is incredibly helpful. A reminder to anyone watching this, I think we have time for potentially 1 to 2 questions from the audience, so you can submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. But I'll begin with a quick question from myself. Claudius, I know you touched on this. If some iteration of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act is included in the final NDAA, do you think that will accelerate the current rulemaking process in the SEC? What exactly would next steps be following its passage by the end of the year?
It's a terrific question, Allison. You know, I think you're going to have some rulemaking that the SEC will be empowered to pursue under the legislation. There'll still be terms and concepts that have to be fleshed out on the regulatory side. So it won't be necessarily the case that these requirements will kick in immediately. There'll probably be a bit of a lag in terms of waiting for that rulemaking to occur. And I would expect that if the legislation is passed, that the SEC would probably put a pause on its other rulemaking, but part of that would depend on how that legislation ultimately gets implemented, and are there any gaps, are there any things that the SEC would have to complement or require, for example, the exchanges to complement with their own standards. And so you'd have to wait and see how some of that might work itself out. But it certainly, I think it certainly would make the necessity for that independent rulemaking approach much less.
So I could supplement what Claudius just said. I think the Commission and the financial services or industry is very much aware that China is now having a great deal of high growth companies, right? The emerging market is a very large investment space. And a lot of US money has already gone into Chinese companies that are listed in the US. So I frankly don't think that for all the saber rattling, I don't think the US market is really saying we're going to have a massive disruption where suddenly all the Chinese company gets kicked off the market, right? That's really not good for the US investors. There has been a lot of discussion about how do we encourage the Chinese company and the Chinese regulator to in fact comply with our set of rules for access to our market, which is very legitimate, but also not shut that door. And so that's why I think Claudius is saying, look, the SEC will have to tread a pretty careful line here. And the legislation that has been put on the books is remarkably short for a potentially very large effect. So SEC would be then stuck with filling in all the blanks and trying to find a workable solution so that there's no major disruption to the market.
And Liza, I absolutely agree. The thing to keep thinking about is the long leash on this legislation creates space for some different outcomes here. And right now, given that a lot of this is in the context of this larger political situation that we're in a pre-election season, and we're also anticipating that if there is a change in administrations, that a Democratic administration would take on these issues just as fiercely, if not more fiercely. And so what we can anticipate is that if companies do not get kicked off these exchanges for well beyond 3 years, you still have an opportunity to try to reach a workable compromise. I don't know how optimistic I would be necessarily. I think both sides have come up with fairly hardened positions, and it's going to be very hard for one side not to compromise without looking, so quote unquote weak. But there still is room, and I think the fact that you see companies still listing on U.S. exchanges, notwithstanding the rhetoric and notwithstanding the legislation and the other rulemaking initiatives. We just recently had a company raising more than $2 billion on a U.S. exchange. And people might wonder, well, why are you doing that in the midst of all of this movement against Chinese listed companies? And I think the markets are telling, at least somewhat the markets are telling the rest of the world, we think there's a way through this on this narrow question of the PCAOB getting access to these audit firms. Whether they're right or wrong, time will tell.
Thank you. I want to be really mindful of time, but if you can very quickly answer this question from the audience, I'd really appreciate it. How may any of these rules eventually extend to fund managers that can invest in China from the United States?
So I don't see this legislation as necessarily addressing how U.S. money can invest in Chinese companies. That's a larger question that would have to be addressed, and the administration or the next administration would have to address through different legal levers. What this legislation is doing, it's saying these Chinese companies cannot list here, so their shares are not accessible through U.S. exchanges. That's a different question about whether U.S. investors can access these companies on Hong Kong Exchange, on the London Exchange, or on the Star Market, for example. So we're not looking at a complete isolation of these Chinese companies in that sense. It's only whether foreign investors can use U.S. exchanges to invest in these companies, or U.S. investors can access these companies on those exchanges.
I would say this is a gigantic chess game that is being played, right? There is technology competition between China and U.S. right now. There is financial competition between U.S. and China right now. And so the Sarbanes-Oxley and the PCAOB piece of it is only a very small piece of this pie, or this big picture. Now, I think Claudius has it right, whereby because this rule has been on the books, because it is a very clean-cut rule, because it is sort of a very obvious, look, if you want to access our market, you're going to have to live by our rules, it makes very good sense, and it is a very legitimate requirement that the Chinese can't really push back on, right? So you have the moral right to it. But on the other hand, that only limits one part of whether you allow them into the market. In a scenario where there are alternatives, like the Hong Kong market, the Singaporean market, the China market, which all have their own flaws and historically does not compare as well with the U.S. markets, but they are now growing and developing very well. You then have a question of money is fungible. It flows around the world, I think, every 8 seconds, right? It could circle the globe in 8 seconds. Your question is, are you trying to protect the U.S. market, or are you trying to protect the U.S. investors because they need the option of investing in high growth areas, of which China happens to be one? So direct answer to the question is, at this point, no, it doesn't limit, the regulation that's proposed does not limit any fund manager that is set up and has access to the Asian markets. But on the other hand, that begs the question of, do you want to, right? And what does that do to the larger market and the capability of the US money being able to access the higher growth markets? But that's a much bigger question.
Excellent answer. And it appears we've reached the end of our panel. I want to thank you both again for this incredibly detailed coverage of a constantly evolving issue. I definitely know that I will be closely following it, especially as the SEC prepares to develop potential rules that could lead to the delisting of Chinese companies from US exchanges. Thank you both again, and I hope you both enjoy your afternoon. And if there are any additional questions that we weren't able to get to in this panel, I think you can potentially send them to myself or Paul, and we would be happy to forward them to the panelists.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Liza.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.